When you're watching the operations being done in Ukraine into Russia or whatever, what are you thinking?
It's two different wars in a sense right now. Russia, when you follow some of their channels, they're constantly focused on where are they taking terrain, where are the offensives, which new settlement has been, quote, liberated. And it's at this point, they're all small ones, but a couple different areas where they're pushing. And then, of course, every night they've got these very large drone missile strikes into Kyiv and other city centers. Ukraine, day after day, continues to hit what appear to be Russian military infrastructure across Russia. I mean, they're launching, it is almost every day now. There is a significant, oh my God, another airbase got hit. That's the Ukrainian war right now, is they are trying to find a way to kind of wear down the Russian military. They're going after rail yards, they're going after rail lines, fuel trucks, again, all the way back to airfields. But Ukraine is not trying to advance necessarily along the front. You start putting hundreds of these long-range drones into Russia day in and day out, that has a serious impact.
This is The Global Gambit.
All right, so we've discussed US national security, Iran, Israel, but as we touched upon in that part one, Preston, is, NATO and Trump's statements versus what he's doing. And we had a very interesting NATO summit in The Hague, and there's now a new commitment to 5%, apart from the Spanish, because the Spanish want to be different. What did you take away from the summit, but also sort of Trump's comments at the summit? I'll break down into a couple of specific ones in a second, but what's your overall takeaways?
Look, overall, I think it was great. It was not out of the question 6 months ago that Trump might not go to the NATO summit at all. We've had real conversations in the past few years about a desire in the United States of withdrawing from the alliance entirely, and you'll still see those debates happening. They don't have a ton of traction, but they're happening nonetheless. So I think NATO is great. I think that it is a huge benefit to the United States. I think it is a solid alliance that we should maintain and build. But that sentiment is not uniform across the United States, not by a long shot. And we saw Secretary Hegseth go there a few months ago, right out the gate, and had some pretty harsh words for NATO. And it had kind of taken the back burner for a bit. But this summit, from what I can tell, yes, there could have been more that came out of it, but holy cow. I think it was great across the board. President Trump a couple times was talking about how important the alliance was, and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important kind of things. And the 5%, we'll see. I'm optimistic that we'll get there. But how do you say anything bad about that? I mean, my goodness, we've been pushing this for years, and we have started to see a lot of the countries increase defense spending, especially following 2014. But great. Whatever it takes to get more NATO countries increasing their defense spend to deter Russian aggression. I think it's great.
Yeah. I was quite surprised by a couple of comments. The one that is on the top of my head now is that he had I'm going to paraphrase, but I have a new appreciation for the love of NATO because it's for the love of protection and prosperity of their countries. And basically Trump was, I don't want to say humble, that's a bit too strong for Mr. Trump, but he was certainly a bit more measured, a little bit more cognizant of it. And I thought that was whoa, that's actually quite a shift. Again, I'm not going to get carried away that he said statements back in the past when he nominated Keith Kellogg to be the special envoy to Russia and Ukraine. Quickly that changed, right? But there certainly seems to have been a step down or draw down or whatever rhetoric around defund, destroy or dismantle, right? So yeah. Do you think he's in it now? He's committed to Ukraine, NATO, in a Trump sense? He's not Biden, he's not a multilateralist, he's a isolationist or whatever. So do you think he's not going to leave NATO? He's just going to be very minimalist in how much he puts in?
I don't think leaving NATO was ever actually in the cards, but the fact that was a conversation was concern. It kind of showed where some of the sentiment was in the United States. So I don't know that Trump ever would have necessarily pushed that to the point of actually going to the Senate for a vote or anything. I think a big part that's we're kind of skipping over is that was a win for Trump. The 5%. He's the one who began, from what I know, he's the one that began pushing that conversation, at least publicly. And I think he views that, and rightfully so, views that as a big win. And I wonder if that kind of ties him to NATO in a way that he wasn't previously. Maybe he feels a little bit more ownership because he was able to get a deal done at the alliance. I don't know, speculation, but I feel like that's a little bit of his personality.
Are you saying that he feels now obligated because he's got the commitments that he was pushing for, and now he's like, shit, no, I actually have to stick to it because that's what I said because the Europeans have followed through?
I wish obligated was the term here. I don't think that's the right one. maybe like almost like a sense of pride in something you built, right? If you build
True.
something,
Yeah.
maybe you
It's a pride. Yeah. Yeah. No,
yeah.
yeah, fair. Yeah, more about himself framing, not because he's obligated to it out of his own altruistic nature. Fair, but this is still 10 years, and we have a growth issue in Europe. I mean, the American economy is insane. You guys are still growing at just unfair rates, right? Europe is doing 1%, 1.5% growth per annum, varied obviously between the different countries themselves. But the EU is not US in its innovation and explosion. I like to feel bullish still about Europe at the moment. But the point I'm making is that there are cost concerns, and where are we going to see that follow through still? Over the Trump administration, probably, but are European nations going to be like, well, okay, I guess maybe we'll push it back a couple of years? They'll keep. I don't know. Do you think that's possible?
Well, it's such an interesting dynamic with NATO, and I think we in the United States sometimes get hung up on the it's 2%. Why isn't everybody doing 2%? And kind of forgetting that it's 32 different countries, 32 different domestic priorities, 32 different types of government in a sense, 32 different leaders of those countries. And it's not the easiest thing to, if you're not already at 2%, to increase your budget in a way to get there.
No.
And I don't know. We have countries that aren't hitting 2% now. And what happens is they get sternly worded letters every so often. There's I
don't hit the Spanish. Yo no tengo un problema, disculpe.
Yeah, no problem.
There you go. That's my sort of to the Spanish watchers. My Spanish to you. Please don't hate me for calling out Spain, but you're the only ones who rejected 5%. Sorry,
but there's nothing that comes of it though, right? I mean, it's a pledge is the way to look at 2%, and 5% is the same thing. It's a pledge. We would like to get there. We commit to trying our best. If they don't hit it, it's not like you're kicked out of NATO, or you don't get Article 5 protection, or you can't be a part of any of these training exercises. So, they're...
But actually, on that point though, mate, that was the other statement. Thank you for reminding me though, because whilst Trump had nice things to say in principle about what NATO represents, symbolizes, he did have a couple of things about specifically Article 5, right? I can't remember the exact statement again, but it was along the lines of, well, we'll have to see about that sort of sentiment. So there is a lot of real concern amongst, well, particularly Berlin, Paris, London, about Trump's propensity. Yes, he still is in NATO, but if Article 5 were activated by, say, the Baltic states, right, there was that Bloomberg article, war game from a week ago, and it was running through a scenario of what a Russian assault would look like into the Baltics, maybe Poland or Finland, right? And so there was a lot of emphasis about, well, if we activate Article 5, because some of the rapid deploy forces, or whatever the acronym is for the forces up there, because they can hold back the Russian assault for, I think it was upwards of 36 to 48 hours. But after that, they need supplement deployments. And if the Americans are not going to come through on that, because they don't want to see Article 5, then it doesn't matter whether or not they're part of NATO if they're not going to act on that. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's tough because personally, I would say anytime a member state is asked about Article 5, the default answer has to be, of course, we're part of the alliance. Like you can't put any gap there. That said, there's so much to be said around Article 5. Cyber attacks technically would now quantify as an Article 5. You could bring forward, a country could present Article 5 for a cyber attack. There's a lot of different things. And then, again, it's not so clear cut, like a missile fired at Ukraine overflies the target and hits Poland. That does not automatically mean that U.S. bombers need to be hitting Moscow the next day. And I think the reason that we see some of this kind of wiggling is not wanting to get boxed in the event that something minor happens. But again, personally, as if I'm sitting here representing NATO, I would always say Article 5 is rock solid, right? Like every country, it exists. That's why we're there.
Well, that's what you went to. You were invited by them, weren't you? So that's pretty cool. So you basically are their YouTube spokesman, right?
Yeah, there we go. Officially,
he isn't, but I
don't think they'll own up to that. Yeah.
But before anyone sort of goes, is he? But okay, so we've got this, I don't know, ambiguity about commitment to NATO, et cetera, et cetera. But on the European front, I'm very interested for your take from across the Atlantic about the state of European security vis-a-vis Ukraine, right? We have had all sorts of comments by the French, the British, the Germans about all sorts. Poland is ramping it up. Well, they're on 4.5% as it is.
Yeah.
The Spanish, not so much. I'm just
You're on it
bashing
today, man.
Spain
Yeah.
today, isn't it? Yeah,
We're
I don't know what's
Spaniards.
going on. But do you have a lot of fear about the state of the European security apparatus at the moment?
I would say increasing fear as we move west from Ukraine, as we get further and further from Ukraine, generally speaking. When you look at the Baltics and at Poland, they're not messing around. They know what's going on. They're taking this very, very seriously. And it seems like every week there's a new commitment or a new initiative where it's like, oh my God, they're really going here. Which was it Estonia that just pledged some crazy amount of drones to Ukraine?
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? So it does seem like the countries right there that could be immediately affected are ready to go. But as we move further away, it's hard to tell because we're seeing a lot of, Macron at times has sounded very hawkish and like he's ready to lead the coalition of the willing into Odessa, and then nothing really happens. So the talk is there. It does sound like Germany might be making a bit of a move to some stronger support of Ukraine in the near future. But again, man, we're talking 3 years into this conflict, and I don't know what more it would take. So I don't know. I don't know if that's a domestic issue from country to country or a government one, or maybe a combination of both. But it seems like the talk is there, but there's not a lot backing it up still. And that's not to say things haven't improved or changed, or that Europe is not, of course, supporting Ukraine and providing to their collective defense. But it just seems like it would have taken much larger steps at this point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. From what I understand, at a strategic level, the Europeans are pursuing more and more defense pacts with, a lot of them are, to be honest, the existing nations of NATO or traditional allies and partners in Asia or whatever, right? As a contingency plan to if NATO really does become a bit of a husk because of the lack of follow through on Article 5 by the Trump administration. But what we're not seeing is a follow through in terms of on the operational or equipment side. So, for example, right here in London, where I'm based at the moment, I was based in Washington for quite a few years. There's a real concern around the nuclear missile systems, right, and Trident, and whether or not because we basically depend on the United States for our ability to use it, and so if this continues in this direction, the Europeans need to find more strategic autonomy, I think is what Macron of France has called it.
Yeah.
Do you think that's viable? Because there's so much reliance on the United States, particularly for, say, logistics, right? The United States is the only one who can provide that overarching provision of radar and things like that.
That's frustrating, man. It would be smart for Europe and a lot of countries that are heavily dependent on the United States to have backup plans, just based off of the way we've been interacting recently. Unfortunately, I'm not sure. We've allowed a little bit of doubt to seep in as to whether or not we will back up our allies. And when you're talking about something like war and peace, you can't have that little bit of doubt. You need to know if somebody has your back or not. So I hate the fact that this is even a conversation. From, in this case, France's perspective, it seems like the common sense thing to do is to look for alternatives. And if you don't have to use those, great. I'm a little bit hopefully we can mend some of these relationships. I don't think any of them are broken at this point. We tried our best to run off the Canadians, and I still think we've got a decent relationship with our brothers and sisters up north, despite our best efforts. And same with Greenland. Like we're not completely at odds yet. So maybe these things aren't completely lost, but yeah, hate that that's been a real conversation recently.
No, absolutely. I think it's tough that the Europeans, from my perspective, I think they get the sense that they're just trying to weather the storm and then wait for maybe a more amicable or aligned head of state to come back in after Trump. But the rate at which, as we were talking in February, the rate at which things are changing every week almost is impossible to really plan for. But, you mentioned Ukraine, and obviously they are demonstrating a unique propensity for innovation or to influence direction of modern warfare. So I made a video a few days ago about how, Ukraine itself is showing a significant shift in military priorities. My point being is that, you don't need necessarily big, heavy military assets. They have a place, but increasingly they might not be the priority right? You can do so much with drones, and you cover this extensively on your channel all the time. So what do you, when you're watching the operations being done in Ukraine into Russia or whatever, what are you thinking?
It's two different wars in a sense right now. Russia, when you follow some of their channels, they're constantly focused on where are they taking terrain, where are the offensives, which new settlement has been, quote, liberated. And it's at this point, they're all small ones, but a couple different areas where they're pushing. And then, of course, every night they've got these very large drone and missile strikes into Kyiv and other city centers. Ukraine, day after day, continues to hit what appear to be Russian military infrastructure across Russia. I mean, they're launching, it is almost every day now. There is a significant, like oh my God, another airbase got hit. So that's the Ukrainian war right now, is they are trying to find a way to kind of wear down the Russian military. They're going after rail yards, they're going after rail lines, fuel trucks, again, all the way back to airfields. But Ukraine is not trying to advance necessarily along the front. So it's, in a weird way, almost like two different wars are being fought. Whereas I think normally we think of two armies coming together and you've got tanks and artillery and infantry, but they're both pursuing different objectives almost, or different means to get to those objectives, if that makes sense. And Ukraine's made a lot of advancements. Just in the last couple of days, their defense minister has talked about, they've got tens of thousands of these long-range drones ready to go. That, we can't ever use the term game changer in war because that's been overplayed too many times, but you start putting hundreds of these long-range drones into Russia day in and day out, that has a serious impact.
Insane. Again, Operation Spiderweb, just the level of planning and misdirection, conversion, whatever, is incredible, right? I don't think we've seen something like that in modern warfare to that extent, at least against a quote-unquote great power, right? What were your reactions to when we first started hearing that?
That was nerve-wracking because in that example, we're Russia, the United States. So we're the country with the big airfields and the big expensive bombers that are quite frankly at risk. And when you see something like that and how effective it was with technology that exists around the world, it's oh my God, we have so many assets around the world that would be at risk of this happening right now. Now, fortunately, while Ukraine made that look easy, it was not easy. And there were a lot of very, very challenging parts to get it, to get that degree of components and drones smuggled inside of a hostile country, to being able to control them remotely from inside of Ukraine, all of that stuff. Very, very complex that nobody's going to be able to pull off the next day. But my first thought was, oh shit, we've got a lot of work to do on our airfields in the United States because we just plain don't have the protection for that. We have, there's degrees of protection at military bases, especially ones that are abroad, but nothing that 50 FPV drones popped up today, especially if they're wire guided, which more and more are, so they're immune to electronic warfare jamming. They're just going to do a lot of damage. And
no, but that was the point I was making just before in that video reference, which is sort of, Russia has spent so much money in these big strategic bombers and etc. Okay. Well, they've just been sort of dealt with by a bunch of DIY FPV drones, right? They literally, I think, what was it? Some of the Ukrainian drones were being used by or made up of equipment that you can buy in your local, in the UK we have called a B&Q, which is sort of like, DIY store, right? They just took a bunch of stuff off the shelf. What does that say about the direction of modern warfare if it's that, I don't know, flexible?
Well, now, the Ukrainians, one thing that I think we look past is it's so easy to say a $500 drone takes out a $50 million aircraft or something. Yes, but the reason they've got it down to a $500 drone is because they've got 70,000 iterations of trying to build that thing and fly it through contested airspace. So they are flying so many of these drones in so many locations across the front that the people putting them together are very, very well versed. So it's not quite the same as again, if China saw that and went, oh, we should do that. Ukraine has a lot of advantages in that realm right now, just because they've been living and dying by these homemade, cheap FPV drones for a couple of years. And it would take a little bit of learning, a bit of a learning curve before another country could get to exactly that degree of kind of complexity.
So we started off this conversation by talking about the expansion to NATO budget and commitments to military spending. To close it, I want to ask your opinion on Putin's, if you saw, recent statements, 24, 48 hours at the time of recording, about the fact that we will probably have to make some defense cuts in the next 3 years. That's interesting. From a man who, is committed to the liberation of the subjugated Russians by the Ukrainian Nazi regime. Obviously, it's not what I think. I'm paraphrasing before anyone loses their mind. Right, so he's put a time horizon effectively on it because clearly the Russian economy cannot sustain this level of war. I think federal military spending is 1/3 now of its whole economic output or spending, budget. What do you take away from that and the state of the Russian military more specifically?
Holy cow. So I hadn't seen that statement. I gotta dig into that. That's interesting because it seems like the exact opposite of what Putin would say, especially following the NATO summit. It seems like he would say, you do 5, we'll do 10 or whatever, just to downplay it, right? Like it's nothing, it doesn't matter. My gut says there's probably more to it where they're going to play with some numbers somehow, maybe pull something into the state or spin something off into, quote, a private entity that is no longer part of government spending or contract soldier salaries or something. They're in no place right now to cut down on military spending. They are, I would argue not much closer to winning the war in Ukraine today than they were year and a half ago. So they've got a lot of work to do, a lot of spending to do, and they're spending so much money, man, between the aircraft that they're losing, having to refurbish those and try to build new ones. The increase in long-range drone strikes has been staggering, which means Russian production has gone through the roof, and they're continuing to pour manpower into this fight. It's hard to look at Russia right now and say where they would cut spending from.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that Bloomberg made a very interesting article about also metals. So their sales to China have jumped almost 56% year on year. Copper sales have jumped 66%, and nickel imports have more than doubled. To the point I'm making is that Russia is literally becoming a client state to China as a way to try to sustain its war in Ukraine. And if Putin makes statements like that, it indicates to me or anyone who watches Russia more specifically that something is up. Because he doesn't make any public acknowledgement unless he really has to. He had to do it over pensions because the Russian government has been distributing or screwing around with people's pensions, which to the point where the Russian people are like, So very interesting there. But yeah, I guess, as we wind down for this time, love to have you back as always. But what would you I encourage people to focus, to look out for? Any expectations or predictions that you might see coming over the summer?
Over the summer, if we're doing nice and broad, I would say let's look for an end in the war in Gaza. Trump has been teasing that in the last few weeks, saying I'd like to see, let's get this thing wrapped up. There's not a lot publicly about what those negotiations look like, but I do think it's possible that, again, Trump, the deal maker, wants to get these big grand deals tied together. He might try to find a way to tie something together between Iran and the release of the hostages and the end of the war in Gaza. A little speculation, but that could be pretty significant if it actually plays out. More Middle East, what I'll be looking at.
More Middle East, and we'll just have to have you back to cover that, I'm sure, myself, and we know where to find you to hear your thoughts on it as well. But Preston Stewart, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to doing this again soon. But everyone else, thanks for watching. Subscribe, like, and do comment below if you agreed or not. And we'll see you all next time. Take care, everyone. Thank you, mate.